All right. Hi, Peter. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com. Today's date is April 14th, 2013, and we're here to discuss gun control in America. Just before we get started, I want to go over two quick ground rules. The first is that right now this conversation is being recorded, and after the recording is completed, I'll be uploading this video to the internet to our YouTube channel. Is that okay with both of you?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
All right, great. And then on top of that, here at Vonvo, we're all about our discussions staying both civil and valuable. We don't want there to be any personal attacks against anyone. Are you guys fine with that ground rule as well?
Yes. Yes.
All right, great. So then let's get our conversation started. Michael, would you mind just giving people a quick background of yourself and why you're so passionate about this topic? And then Peter, you can go ahead right afterwards.
My name's Michael Yarman. I really think the best way to describe why I'm so passionate about this topic is because only armed people are free. Only armed people are free.
Okay, and anything further you want to tell, your the people in the audience, or we'll hand it off to Peter.
Oh, that's good.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead and let Peter. Okay, so I take it from that comment, Michael, you're a bit of an absolutist. Would that be a fair guess on my part? No. No. Okay. So my position is a moderate gun control position. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. As I've said a number of times here, by the time I was 25, knew more people that died from guns than I knew of any other cause. And that reality, to some level or extent, exists today, even although I'm now just about to turn 60. I see guns as a public safety issue. I have no issue whatsoever with the concept of self-defense of the home. I have no issue with the concept of people owning firearms for the various recreational purposes that they are owned. I do, however, believe that there is a constitutional right for the government to regulate, and given recent events and looking particularly at the issues of suicide and the distortion of information on the criminal activities, there is a need for a certain amount of regulation. It is not, I noticed Keith commenting in the in the written comments below, it is not about law-abiding individuals owning guns, but it is about determining at some level who is law-abiding, who is a risk, how great is that risk to the public at large, how do we deal with a commodity that when it's in the wrong hands is a terribly dangerous commodity. When it's in the right hands, there's no risk. However, there are a number of issues, domestic violence being one of them, suicide being another, these recent mass killings being yet another. Those are high and dramatic public events, but they do lead to areas of concern, and how do you address those? So I'm very much, and Keith and I have gone a number of times in writing back and forth, fairly detailed, fairly fact-oriented, and the rest of it. So let's go at whatever direction you care to go, Max or Michael.
Right. So that's great. Thank you for that. So what I was going to say is, ultimately, Michael, can you sort of just give your overall take on the gun control issue? I mean, Peter brings up, as it's a public safety issue. Do you sort of agree or do you see at all where Peter's coming with that? And maybe we can hit on that point first of, how to maybe control or limit, the public safety of Americans when it comes to gun violence.
Okay, certainly. Coming from it, looking at just a public safety issue, it's a non-issue. I've got some numbers here. Hold on just a moment. I'm sorry. I've got to close my door. I don't think you guys need to hear my four-legged alarms.
Yeah, and Peter, what I was just gonna say is because I'm doing the whole muting thing, Peter, and I know sometimes when you're in a discussion, like you can get, you can go back and forth before, like, let's say someone's finished speaking. So, obviously, for the purposes of me not missing anything you're saying, maybe you'll do your best to wait until like Michael's completely done with his points, and I know that he's done, and I can mute you because I'm just trying to drive some traffic to the site as well while moderating. But go ahead, Michael.
All right, I'm going to provide a link in chat, and this is where I'm pulling the numbers from. This gentleman says that his numbers are sourced from the Centers for Disease Control, the FBI, and the U.S. federal government. These are the big killers in the U.S. This is deaths per year from selected causes. Number one on his list is tobacco use at 529,000, followed by medical errors at 195,000. Unintentional injuries, unspecified, but 118,021. Alcohol abuse, 107,400. Motor vehicle accidents, 34,485. Unintentional poisonings, 31,758. Drug abuse, 25,500. Unintentional falls, 24,792. Firearms homicides, 11,493. He did not specify which year or which time frame this is averaged out over. I would have to validate that. Just a moment, please. I've looked at those numbers as well. So first of all, in a number of those issues, on the point we're discussing firearms specifically. Yes, there are diseases. Yes, there are falls. Yes, there are accidents. Some of those diseases are caused by industrial activities and toxins. There's liability issues that are attached to that. Falls obviously have liability issues. Car accidents and accidents have liability issues, and so on and so forth. One of the issues with respect to firearms is that liability and the ability to proceed on liability has been encumbered by various regulations that have been put in place. That's one area of concern. But specifically on the just let me finish, Bruce. Specifically on the numbers from the CDC, using the year 2010 for that, there were 31,518 firearm-related deaths. There were about 58,000 firearm-related injuries. 19,002 of those were suicides. 600 were justified homicides. Of the 600, 201 were situations where a private citizen was involved in the justified homicide, so that's a self-defense issue. Your number of about 11,000 homicides is correct. Firearm homicides now shifting over to the FBI statistics for 2011. There's some confusion about what the total numbers are of the homicides. The number I've been working with for most of my stuff is off of their expanded homicide table 10, which is 12,664 total homicides, 8,583 firearm related. The fact is, with respect to firearms, there are two areas of concern. One is the crime use of firearms, and to some extent the misinterpretation that use is specifically gangbangers killing each other over drugs. From what I can glean from those statistics, it's about 10% of the fatalities. The larger issue there is that the FBI qualifies other argument. And you noticed, you commented with respect to alcohol within your comments of fatalities. And other argument quite frequently is something that's taking place in a public place, such as a bar or a nightclub or outside of a location like that. So we have the use of firearms in that circumstance, and the other area of the concern of the use of firearms is aggravated assault, where the potential is, as a public safety issue, you've got two parties that get into an argument quite frequently over something immaterial, and people are being innocents are being killed, and that's a public safety issue. somebody driving a car and getting into an accident is a public safety issue, and that's heavily regulated, but it is not a constitutional issue. So we're stuck with this: how do we deal with a public safety issue in various circumstances versus a regulatory issue over rights and privileges? You've got 100 million people in the U.S. who roughly own firearms. They now own something in the neighborhood of 300 million firearms, which means that there is close to one gun for every square mile of American territory. And those guns being discharged properly are not an issue. Those guns being discharged improperly are an issue. So you have a very small number of firearm users who are misusing the firearms. And how do you determine in advance, if you can, who those people are, and what do you do with them when they are? So I'll leave it over to you.
Okay. I would like to bring up a point that you made about suicide. There may be a few exceptions here, but the majority of people involved in suicide research at the academic level seem to be in agreement that if you take away one method of suicide, it doesn't prevent someone from killing themselves. They just use another method. As a very good example of this, we can look at Japan, one of the highest suicide rates in the world, and firearm ownership is not allowed by private citizens. You brought up the point, commodity. It's a commodity that is causing this damage. Whether it be a gun, a car, a knife, a tire iron, etc. It's a thing. It's irrelevant, really. In the age of the internet,
I agree with you on that, Michael, because it's a commodity. When you look at the constitutional aspect of it, because it's a commodity, it is subject to the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which gives Congress the distinct and direct ability to legislate and regulate. So
it's irrelevant.
It is a commodity. It is relevant because that's what's in effect in the Firearm Act of 1934, which keeps sawed-off shotguns and machine guns off the street, among other things. So the federal government has quite distinctly, and the Supreme Court has supported to date, the use of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to regulate firearms. Where they stepped in was on how how machine guns that were limited in 1934 were being taxed with effect of machine guns in 1986 that were being manufactured at that time and were a different weapon than what was being regulated in 1934. And they decided that particular tax on that particular weapon was falling under a constitutional issue.
The reason why this is irrelevant is because of the proliferation of knowledge and the advent of the internet. It does not take a great deal of specialized skill sets to make a fully automatic weapon. It's not the 1934 or the 1986 Firearms Acts that prevent machine guns from being used in crimes all the time. The reason why fully automatic weapons aren't used in crimes all the time is because there's no net benefit for the criminal. There's massively enhanced sentencing, and your tool isn't significantly better to make it worth the extra added risk that you're taking. It was the enhancement on sentencing for using these firearms in the commission of a crime that has killed the proliferation in crimes. I think there's been less than 5 crimes where a fully automatic weapon has been used in a crime since the 86 Act.
Well, first I'm going to go back to the suicide issue and address that. With respect to your comment about different items being used and being effective in suicide, the science that I'm looking at, without looking at Japan, the science I'm looking at in North America, is that firearms are considered to be between 85 and 95% effective. Other forms of suicide are effective to the level of about 2%.
That's an attempt.
Pardon?
A a suicide attempt is very different from completing a suicide. Most of the time,
Suicide attempt, cutting your wrist, and a suicide attempt, firing a shotgun into your mouth, are two distinctly events. Two distinctly different events. And the fact is, an effective attempt with a firearm is 85 to 95% effective. So an attempt to hang yourself, an attempt to asphyxiate yourself, attempts to do a variety of other things are successful only to 2%. So there is as many as 10 attempts of someone who is determined to commit suicide. And so there are people that will indeed commit suicide, and our national relationship with that relative to those methods is not that much different from the rest of the industrialized world. Where we stand out is that our firearm suicides are 3 times higher than anybody else in the world. That said, that's a discussion in and of itself. The only aspect of that I believe that we can look at from a truly statistical point at this stage is the fact that about 2,500 of the female homicides are related to intimate murder-suicide. And so there is a criminal element that comes into play. So you've got, of the 19,000, you've got some 2,500 males that are killing themselves after they destroy their families. And that's a concern because that's a truly ugly event because the people that are dying are the innocents. And that's what this is about. Some of this is about the innocents. Going to your point about the use of any kind of rifle, let alone a semi-automatic rifle, or any weapon with a large capacity magazine. Recent study released said there were 84 mass killings between 2000 and 2010, of which over 50% involved the use of a weapon, a semi-automatic weapon of one form or another that had the capacity of accepting a large capacity magazine. So you have 40 or more events that took place with that. If you take into account that the assault weapons ban was lifted in 2004, so you've got 2005 to 2010, so a 5-year window, 40 of the 84, or more than 40 of the 84 events involved the use of large capacity magazines in some form of a semi-automatic weapon for that purpose. Those include, one of the points that was made to me by somebody was, well, these are all public places. That's exactly public, unarmed, gun-free zones. That's exactly the point. Somebody walking into an open location with a particular type of equipment that can dispatch whatever their purpose is, and do so in a matter of minutes is a concern. The first responding officer at the Sikh temple was shot 15 times. The police response time on average in all of these is 3 minutes or less. And in the case of Sandy Hook, the gentleman was in the school for 5 minutes. Apparently, he either had 30 or 50 round magazines, whichever it works out to be. The details of that has gotten confused by all the misinformation that's available in our excessive information system. In any event, he changed magazines 3 or 5 times. And in doing so, somewhere along the line, a number of children, whether it was 6 or 11, managed to get out of harm's way. Had he been restricted to 10-round magazines, he would have spent 10% of his time that he was alive in the school trying to reload his gun. And given that there are several incidences where the shooter in the event was tackled by citizens or taken down by law enforcement, it was at the point that they were changing out magazines. So there is some justification for looking at that. There's some justification for looking at that as a specific. Yes, in general crime it hasn't been used, but the recent death and assassination, if you will, of the DA in Kaufman County, Texas, he and his wife were shot with a weapon that obviously had a large capacity magazine because they were riddled with bullets, and it turns out that they were attacked by what appears to be one attacker who was a disgruntled employee. So the public risk of the particular type of weapon, which is why machine guns are no longer available to the general public without fairly thorough licensing and registration, it exists. I have no objection to some guy at a gun range having access and use of what I will refer to as Rambo recreational guns. They can do that, no big deal. Just allow it to be much more regulated and allow authorities to know where it is. in the event that we end up with a situation like the house in Connecticut, where there's some question about other people in the house and their mental competence.
How would that possibly be? They had a list where all the guns were.
And it is against federal law to keep a national registry. So we're not looking at knowing how many guns everybody has. It's not an issue. It's a non-issue. And it keeps getting raised, and it's a non-issue. It's a non-issue. So the question, how do we address people who will misuse, abuse, or mismanage firearms? Firearm contingent, this 10% of society that doesn't want any form of regulations according to the current surveys. What responsibility are the so-called law-abiding firearm owners prepared to take in respect to controlling what is, in the wrong hands, a dangerous item? In the right hands, no. In the wrong hands, yes. So what responsibility as firearm owners are you prepared to take? And that is where we go for legislation.
Pardon me, sorry. I absolutely hear what you're saying. I understand the point you're making now. I've got you. You are not a typical anti-gun person. It threw me off for a little bit.
Control people that have a concern. I've got grandchildren and children. You've probably got children or grandchildren. I certainly do not want to see, I mean, if you've read any of the descriptions of what happened to those poor children at Sandy Hook, it's appalling. It's appalling. If you read the description of what happened to the DA in Texas, it's appalling. It's truly appalling. It's like, you know, if we were go through meat grinders and doing that, we'd have regulations about it.
With these specific exceptions, and that is prohibition on convicted felons and specific violent misdemeanors, the prohibition against the mentally ill, and when I say the mentally ill, I mean someone who has had their rights abbreviated by due process, a court, something, right? With those prohibitions accepted, what other gun control laws have ever or ever possibly could make any difference?
This is not so much what gun control laws make the difference. It is what impediments that have been put in place towards researching cause and effect. Right? There's several different levels to the argument and the discussion here. No, just let me finish for a second, Michael. I'm sorry my camera keeps doing this funky thing it does.
No worries.
But there are several different levels to the discussion. One is the public safety issue, and what are the public safety issues specifically? One is what are the liability issues and what, if any, can be done there? Because certainly if you look at other commodities, other activities within the general marketplace, if I choose to have a swimming pool in my backyard and the neighbor's kid drowns in it because they've walked into my yard and done that, I'm responsible for that. I have a financial and civil liability that I'm responsible for. So there's a whole area there that's open to discussion. But one of the other issues, and one of the frustrating issues for those of us that are looking at this and trying A, to determine what the problems are, and B, how to resolve those problems, is the number of impediments. And I think the general public would be shocked at the number of impediments that are put in place and that have been put in place through really backroom political shenanigans. They haven't been brought up in front of a full vote. They haven't been identified by the media, and that's the media's fault, not anybody else's. But we have all kinds of riders that get put on the sides of various different bills that limit the ability of the CDC, the ATF, and the FBI to do proper research and data sharing, various different things. Part of that has to do with this unreasonable concern about some sort of national registry. There's a law from 1986 that outlaws that. Let's accept that that's a fact and move on from that. Nobody wants a national registry. Should there be some sort of database tying a specific firearm to a specific cartridge? I believe so, in order to help trace that down more quickly. Serial numbers are part of the equation. Should that at least give some? Why not? We have computers. We have fingerprinting. Why can't you fingerprint a firearm before it's sold to the public?
How are you going to do it?
They're discussing it now.
You mean
they've actually got the ability now to tag individual cartridges and record that. So I mean, the ability exists. I mean, we have radio tags on our clothing when we buy it at Walmart. There's all that technology is coming forward. In fact, one of the things that's going to happen, I suspect, in the future, is that as technology advances, when we talk about the right to bear arms, the nature of the very arms that we're going to be able to bear in the future is going to change, and the technology related to it. Right now, the concept of being able to grab a gun and the gun to know that it's you that's holding the gun.
That's really wonderful technology, and I really hope that it gets implemented in an effective fashion. It's not right now, and it won't be for the foreseeable future. Even if it were, how many existing guns are already in circulation without that technology? How easy is it to?
Just quickly stepping on that issue, should something happen with the LCMs and the assault weapons, one of the things for people to understand is that probability is you're not going to end up with a general confiscation of firearms as a result of that. What you'll end up with is a number of weapons that are grandfathered through, and some limitations in terms of the distribution of those in public, and there'll be some form of governmental buyback at fair market value, because that is what has been put in place in the past and is currently operating in a couple of different places. So the perspective that I think part of the issue is, and I'm seeing some of these comments on the bottom here, people rattling away about the Constitution is this, the Constitution is that. The fact of the matter is, there's the Commerce Clause within the Constitution, which holds equal weight to everything else in the Constitution, and that gives the Congress the full authority to regulate whatever it chooses to regulate. Then we have the freedom of speech, the First Amendment, and so on down through the other amendments. And you see that, just let me finish my statement here. You see that as you go through the various different amendments, that there are limitations and various different things that are placed on those from a larger public good. Somebody's comment here, I think it was Archer's, is that the Constitution is all about freedom and the rest of it. We are not a libertarian society. We are a democratic society, and the Constitution was created. Call it a republic, call it a democracy, whatever you want to call it. The Constitution was related with a hierarchy. The states are at one level. The federal government is at another level. The Constitution deals with how those two entities deal with each other and where the authority falls. At the end of the day, the final authority on all of this is the Supreme Court. It's part of the checks and balances. And the Supreme Court rulings have, as much as they've opened up the opportunity with respect to the Second Amendment, have also placed and still place limits on the Second Amendment. And it is a fact of life that there are limits on the Second Amendment that is being ignored in the debate. Whether there are more limits in the future or less is for the court to decide as we go forward. It does appear that they will be visiting that issue, and they may be doing it sooner rather than later. Somebody is asking me to it's Keith. Hi, Keith. I'll let you talk now, Michael. Sorry.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the liability issue. So if I go out and I shoot someone, I'm not liable for that?
You may be found liable for it, but there are certain limitations put on that liability. The weapon you use, the manufacturer and the seller of that weapon are not liable, that's for sure.
Why would they be liable?
Well, they may be.
Why would General Motors be liable if you took a car and ran down a bunch of school children?
If there's an aspect in that car that makes them liable. One of the things, just law perspective, okay? From the pure law perspective, taking the libertarian point of view of law, from the pure law perspective, from the moment something is created to the moment it is destroyed, somebody along the way may have liability. If I'm driving down the road and I get stung by a bee and I swerve across the road and crash into the car opposite direction, you and I might, as laymen, term that as an accident. From the lawyer's perspective, I'm liable because I had my arm out the way. The manufacturers and dealers of guns, certainly the dealer of guns, has a certain responsibility to vet whoever it is that they're selling the firearms, and within whatever the regulations of the time of the day are. Today, that's a pretty wide open event, but if that gets narrowed down more, and someone like this character that did the Gabby Giffords shooting is identifiable as a risk, and they choose to sell him the equipment and the means to do so, of course they're liable. Whether they have the potential to be liable, whether they're found liable is a different question. But they are restricted at present from any liability. And that in and of itself, in my view, is unconstitutional. But that's a case that'll take some long time to get to court.
Danced around a dozen different legal arguments without actually touching any of them.
Association is quite adept at dancing around issues the same way. It's you walk around, you run into a fence, you find out what the fence is, and you deal with it. The fact is that what's his face, the fellow in the subway in New York, Bernard, he was found liable. I think at the end of the day, he's having to pay some $11 or $12 million for the one black male that ended up paralyzed as a result of the shooting. Which, from the perspective of being a firearm owner and looking at the stand your ground states and the various self-defense arguments that are being put forward, is something to consider that he indeed was found liable. So, in a circumstance where somebody believes that they're doing something appropriate and it turns out that they're not, that's do you jump into a river to save a drowning child and end up being sued because you're a good Samaritan because the child drowns? I mean, those kinds of difficult legal questions are exactly what makes the law interesting to those people who are interested in it.
Wow. All right.
Yeah, Michael, take your time to present whatever you want to present. I know
Let's
Peter's addressed a few different points.
A person kills someone with a car or a gun. Doesn't matter which. For the sake of this argument, they're both free of manufacturer's defect. For the sake of this argument, both sellers, either the seller of the car or the seller of the gun, did all legal and proper due diligence to make sure that they were not selling something to someone who would use it in an inappropriate fashion to hurt people. What liability is there beyond the person who did the deed?
In those circumstances, the issue is with respect to firearms, that limitation doesn't exist. I can go to a gun show, I can contact somebody. At the moment, I can buy a firearm in some locations over the internet. I can do a variety of different things. And the trail goes full at my acquisition, and so that liability can't be followed back. Whether that's a gun trafficking issue, or whether that's just an incompetent salesperson, or whether that's somebody knowingly selling a firearm to somebody who's a risk, that's not determinable at the moment. Part of the
How are you going
argument
to stop black market sales?
Well, you can't stop black market sales except to treat them as criminal events and persecute them on that basis. But you got to be able to track them, and that's part of the idea of the tagging of ammunition and the database on the fingerprinting, if you will, of the guns. And the fact of the matter is, there is a point that I will concede to you to a degree, that at some point the fatalities become irrelevant. They reach a point of irrelevance. There will be a level of crime that will take place where criminals will kill each other. They will kill each other with firearms. There will be circumstances where they kill each other with other weapons. There are people that are intent. Hear me out, please. There are people that are intent upon killing each other. However, when you look at the issue of suicide, when you look at the issue of alcohol use and its relationship to fatalities, a variety of different means, but certainly with respect to firearms, when you look at drug use and the fatality that are related to that, there are areas within respect to firearm death specifically where we can cut those numbers down dramatically. And we do so by putting out, if you will, a fishnet that captures some of the elements along the way. For example, juvenile delinquents that have been charged and found guilty of an event have a recidivism rate that's quite high later on. Banning them from access to a firearm until the age of 30 has the ability, if you will, or the result of greatly diminishing the potential use of a firearm in a future criminal event, because the majority of people, by the time they reach 30, yeah, so that is one of the areas where it could be expanded. But the various
That
different
has
people
absolutely
that are,
nothing to do with gun regulation. That's criminal regulation.
that's a regulation reflecting guns. That's the point here. You can't look at it with the blinders on. It's a wide open discussion about a variety of different things. None of the solutions are
rights and privileges amended by a court. That's already a non-issue.
Because at the end of the day, if we're talking about what can be amended or not by the court and by the Congress, we don't need to be having a public debate about what's going on, because I've got great confidence in the ability of the Congress and the courts to refine this, and in fact, there will be regulation in place. At the ability of the day, there will be changes that come about as a result of these recent events.
The Congress that wants to ban the shoulder thingy that goes up, the Congress that thinks the internet is a series of tubes,
about stuff. I mean, I have some serious questions about who's in Congress these days too, but that's not getting into that discussion. That's pretty much irrelevant. But at the end of the day, the history of the Congress as an entity and the history of the courts, eventually they find the path of common sense, if you will. I'll use common sense as a subjective term, but they eventually do get down a path that makes sense.
I think that you have much more faith in our federal government than I do.
Our association with it. And I have taken the time to look at what it does and doesn't do, and what it has and hasn't done in various different places.
Ever been a part of it?
All these Sorry?
Ever been a part of it?
Not directly, no.
Okay.
I've had a great deal of connection with it through various other forms.
Contract?
Not individual. I've got a brother who works for Housing and Urban Development.
Gotcha. Okay.
I mean, through my background is as I said, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I'm associated with a number of people that have had play in the government at various times, from the 60s till today. I'm just looking at some of these comments on the bottom here. Just give me a second.
And Michael, I mean, feel free to bring up any individual arguments that you wanted to share, let's say, with Peter.
Well, what Peter's talking about here is regulations, trying to regulate people who shouldn't have guns from having them. And that's something that nobody rational really disagrees with. And the argument is what methods are going to be used to make this effective. And I'm saying that none of these proposals that Peter's putting forward are going to work. We know that they won't work.
What?
They've all been tried in states before. California's an excellent example. We've had this universal background check for the last 20 years. Crime rate hasn't been effective. The bottom line is that all of Peter's arguments are based on more guns equals more crime. And the fact is undeniable that currently in the U.S. we have more guns than ever before. And we have, at the moment, a crime rate lower than we've had since the 60s.
I think when you discount my argument saying more guns equals more crime, I'll put it to you this way: put bubble wrap down on the floor, and you're going to step on a bubble, right? That's the nature of the beast. right? We can argue the logic of both sides of that. At the end of the day, what we have is we have 300 million guns, more or less, in private hands, whether it's 270 or 300 million. They're increasing at a rate of 15% per year. We will have double the number of guns in under 6 years.
I think it's probably a faster rate than you think.
And smaller percentage of society as far as the legal registered guns. Okay, people buying guns legally.
Up until the last 8 years, I would have agreed with you on that. There's been a big shift in the last 8 years.
Well, it hasn't reflected in the current statistics, though. And that's you have to wait 2 years to see that.
Yeah.
But the fact is, on from the 50% of the population owning guns to about a 30% of the population owning guns. And one of the reasons that that's happening, according to various sources that have cited that, is that we have a changing demographic in how our households are structured. And we are moving away from the paternalistic, male-dominated household to a variety of blended types of households. And that is the principal reason. And that takes me back to
firearm ownership is women.
Sorry?
Currently, the fastest growing demographic of firearm ownership is women.
Counterpoint to that is that the fastest and the highest probability of straw purchasers is women. So is it in fact women buying firearms for the purpose of self-protection? Is it in fact women buying firearms for somebody else? That is
well,
a question.
That's a good question.
But that's a question that needs to be resolved. It's up the point that I have made earlier about the ability to reference and research. The National Rifle Association will say whatever it wants because in lots of ways it's managed to create the environment. It can say, well, enforce the laws. Well, it's done a great deal on its part to inhibit the ability to do so. So, it's kind of a no-win situation for anybody who confronts that.
It's done a great deal to, okay, first of all, the NRA has its issues. Okay, that's a whole different argument that we could talk about for a long time, and you'll be surprised on how many points I agree with you there. However, go ahead.
Firstly, on how many points about gun ownership, I agree with you. The point being that we have a problem with respect to so many people are dying every year. It is not unreasonable to say, to look at how do we go about reducing those numbers, not only marginally but significantly, and can it be done? You have 25% of the homicides roughly, don't hold me to the specific statistic, which are related to intimate murder suicide. Right? Go back to my point about paternalistic household, and that's an issue to address. We have a high incidence of alcohol use in both suicides and homicides, alcohol presence in those circumstances. So that's an issue. Do we extend the prohibitions to people who have habitual problems with alcohol? Somebody who's got more than one or two DUI convictions, or somebody who's been fired from a job because of alcohol or drug abuse. I know that drug users are currently limited under the laws, but how effective are those laws? I agree with you on the effect of the laws. They need to be enforced on the levels that they exist. But we have, my point is more, if we can affect a 10 or 20 or 30% reduction, that's 10,000 lives. That's a lot of lives.
Right. So
when you work out.
Just quickly, what I was going to say is, in a couple of minutes, I have to run to record another discussion. And so what I was going to say is, Michael, you bring up that you don't really see some of Peter's suggestions actually, working. Would you mind maybe covering for the people that are inside of the discussion listening what you alternatively think some solutions that would work, what they would be? And I mean, there's some people that are in the audience that are asking some questions, and Keith asks about, how would you address all the different killings that have taken place in Connecticut since, Sandy Hook? So if you guys maybe want to address what some of the points people are making down below, that'd be great. And, I'll certainly be in touch with both of you. So thanks so much for participating.
And I would suggest, Michael, it's coming up to the end of the hour here. I suggest that we probably try and keep ourselves to maybe another 15 minutes.
Certainly.
Is that what-
No, I'll be very brief. There are two things that I could see policy-wise that we could do that would impact the firearm fatality rates even more than the 20% to 30% range that you're looking at. And that is the end of prohibition against drugs and seeing the time, effort, resources, and money that we put into the prohibition against drugs into public mental health.
There's no question about that. I mean, that's a reality.
I can print one.
Yeah, I've heard about these 3D printers and whatever that's a concern.
You can't.
Right, at the end of the day, the end of the day, though, Michael, if you consider yourself a law-abiding individual, if you are in fact a law-abiding individual, and I mean, both you and I can go probably to any location and find marijuana or whatever that's illegal. Yeah. Whether or not we do that is a choice we make, right? There is a regulation, depending at this point, depending on where you live. You know, so you as a citizen have to make choices. I mean, and those choices are to abide by various laws.
Talking about rational, law-abiding people who you admit aren't the problem.
Bans or the permit bans and background checks or whatever you want to call them, and you start to look at people who have habitual misdemeanors that are non-violent, but non-violent misdemeanors. You know,
like speeding,
like just a general disregard for misdemeanor style laws.
Parking tickets.
Pardon? Well, potentially.
Okay.
Non-payment of taxes. You know, potentially. I mean, they you know, obviously you can go to the point of ridiculous, but the fact of the matter is that if you look at that and then you look at the statistics of that particular behavior and whether or not it plays a role in events, you have a basis in argument.
I got it. You're trying to look at statistical information to determine probability of committing a crime and trying to restrict those people from owning firearms?
Whether or not there's a basis for it depends on what the statistics reveal. But it's certainly an avenue to look at because, again, if you talk about people, I mean, I've had conversations with a number of very reasonable gun owners, and I have no concern. I mean, I'm quite confident that of the 100 million people that own guns, the vast majority are responsible individuals.
Law enforcement did something along those lines. It was called profiling.
Pardon?
Law enforcement did something along the lines that you're talking about. It was called profiling.
I'm not saying it's profiling. I'm saying whether or not you expand those background checks to include a certain behavioral type, and that is a question of, or do they get further scrutiny, and so on. Those are all questions there. Hello, Eric. You want to join into the conversation? It looks.
Eric, can you hear us?
I'm not sure where. Maybe I'm not sure where Eric's.
Sorry about that. I had to go get some coffee.
Anyway, Mike, I don't know. We've done this now for about an hour and a half. So I'm more than happy to have another conversation with you in the future if that's. We'll just get Max to set something up if that works for you. Is that Eric?
Yeah, this is Eric. Can you hear me? Now I'm kind of jumping in midstream here, but from what I heard, you guys are talking about mainly the pragmatic aspects. Has anyone really considered just the sheer moral aspect of someone's right to not only defend themselves, but because of the principles of this country and how it's founded on a constitutional republic, the right to hold the government itself accountable through force, legitimate means as described in the Second Amendment. I mean, has that been a consideration?
Run the question again here, Eric. I'm trying to grasp where you're headed.
Okay, let me word it. This country was founded in blood. I mean, we had to fight off the fetters of a tyrant in order to, assert ourselves, assert our liberties, what we felt were God-given rights. If you're a theist, or even, if you're an atheist, those intrinsic human rights. It calls it inalienable rights in the preamble. So, how does that work today? I mean, are we still of the mindset that we have a right to self-govern? And if so, how are we going to assure that right?
Constitution, right? And within the structure of the, we got a lot of echo here. I mean, I think what Eric, that in and of itself becomes a whole hour of discussion. We've gone around. We've discussed it to some level here. Michael is of one view. I'm of a different view. I look at the Constitution as a whole document, and the rights that are granted within it have their various different limitations placed on them. And I take the view that many of the rights that are being discussed today are of reasonable limit. They're not. You talk about infringement, or you talk about inalienable rights. We have a variety of inalienable rights, which we have various limitations that are placed upon them. And within the structure of the Constitution, as a self-governing democratic republic, we have given the Congress the authority to regulate various aspects, and certainly with respect to the Second Amendment, depending on how one chooses to read the language of the amendment, it makes reference to both well-regulated and infringement, and under what circumstances that regulation and infringement takes place. The initial intent of the document in the historical legal perspective is one of a well-regulated militia. The current status of the individual right to bear arms has been put in place more recently in 2008 by the Supreme Court's Heller decision. And that doesn't change the fact that within the Constitution you have the Commerce Clause, which allows and has been held constitutional in terms of regulating specific things. Go ahead.
Constitution cannot do. Example, Congress shall make no law. Correct?
A crowded theater.
Right, but speaking about the Bill of Rights, a limitation on government. Right? Are we in agreement on that? Right, it's specifically saying these are things that the government. I understand. I'm not trying to argue that. I'm not trying to make that argument.
Respect to firearms has been upheld as constitutional. So you
That's
have.
not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You made a specific reference that said the militia referred to the government until the 2004 Heller McDonald, or was it? No, it wasn't Heller McDonald. It was. Right. So the Second Amendment saying shall not infringe really meant that the government shall not infringe on the government's right to own arms?
You want to connect with me through Vonvo on Facebook, I'll send you a couple of articles from the various law schools with respect to the history of the Second Amendment, just to give you.
So because somebody at a law school thinks that it's a good legal
It's
argument.
not somebody at, hang on here, mate. We're talking about the leading law schools in the country, where the judges that are sitting on the Supreme Court and the lawyers that are arguing in front of them, and the people that are in the Congress.
So let's say you have an impeccable argument, an impeccable source that legally creates a legal fiction where the intent of the law gets ignored immediately in favor of its letter. What's the point of writing laws?
It's a legal fiction.
Okay.
What's a legal
Talking
fiction?
about laws, there are two parts to a law: the intent of the law and the letter of the law, the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. These are actual legal terms. They're in Latin. I don't know them and have to look them up. So we write the law to perform action X. Whether that's prohibit the government from making laws infringing on people's right to bear arms, or regulate the shipment of oranges from California to Florida. Doesn't matter.